Welcome everyone to a Kepler Community webinar. Today we have Astrology, Alchemy, and Magic in Hellenistic Antiquity. Cheak is our presenter today. He is a scholar of comparative religion and philosophy and esotericism. He teaches a history of Eastern and Western alchemies at the University of Philosophical Research. He received his doctorate in religious studies from the University of Queensland in Australia in 2011 for his work on the French Hermetic philosopher René Schwaller de Levis. I'm not quite certain of my pronunciation there.
It's a mouthful.
And he has also been trained in various other spirigic elixirs from the Paracelsus College. He's a practitioner within Vajrayana Buddhism. He's presently living in the Antipodes, where he maintains an active interest in tea, wine, poetry, topography, and alchemy. It's a great collection of interests there. Let's see, anything else that I should say about all the various things you're into that would be of interest, do you think?
Oh, I don't know. Just the fact that I'm coming to you today from the future.
That's true. You are coming to us today from the future because he is around the world from us. He is now in Sunday morning, where I'm in Saturday afternoon. Today we are doing, I guess, a little bit of alchemy and magic by having our time zones like this. Today we're talking about astrology, alchemy, and magic in Hellenistic Antiquity. Our Erin is going to start with some information on the culture of the Egyptian temple in the Greco-Roman Egypt, how they somewhat fell apart, and how we can kind of recover the thread of unity that binds astrology, alchemy, and magic, particularly as theurgy, which he'll be talking about. So welcome. I'm very delighted to have you here today.
Thank you, Enid. It's great to be here. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming today. As Enid said, my talk is on astrology, alchemy, and magic in Hellenistic Antiquity. And I've called this a survey of the sister sciences because I kind of conceive these traditions in that fashion. So I just want to briefly talk a little bit about my background, or kind of how I came to studying astrology, I suppose. So I'm mostly known as a scholar of alchemy, and a large part of my research always seemed to draw me back to the esoteric traditions of Greco-Egyptian antiquity. As an undergraduate and in my early postgraduate work, I looked at the history and theory of magic, and in particular Greco-Egyptian traditions and theurgy. But my doctoral work focused on the history of alchemy, and once again, this work always seemed to bring me back to the Egyptian temple culture in late antiquity, the sacred sciences. And so during this time, I was dipping more and more into astrology. So I was studying the history of magic and alchemy, and dipping increasingly into the world of astrology. And as a scholar by nature, I was always interested in getting to the bottom of the sources of this tradition. And of course, one thing as a scholar of these traditions that I realize is that the modern forms that this material comes down to us in is often superficial or distorted. So I've always had this great desire to get back to the origins of the art, and to really in order to get a rich insight into its proper nature, you really have to go ad fontem, to the source. So while I don't consider myself a specialist in Hellenistic astrology per se, I have a lot of friends and colleagues in the astrological world who are largely scholars and practitioners of traditional, that is Hellenistic, medieval, Renaissance astrology. And I share their passion for understanding these traditions in their original spirit and context. And so what struck me as I began to explore this material from my own vantage was the many overlaps and similarities that exist between the world of Hellenistic astrology and that of Greco-Egyptian alchemy and magic, or theurgy. So it was clear to me, at least, that all of these traditions drew upon a common hermetic fund. So I'm going to give you an overview of today's class. I mean, what Enid presented at the beginning was what I intended to do a few months ago. And what I'm doing today is shifted it a little bit, but you're still going to get a nice taste of astrology, alchemy, and magic in the Hellenistic world. But what I really want to do today is explore this Egyptian Hermetic background of astrology and look at some of the more significant overlaps between astrology, alchemy, and magic. And I think as we do this, we start to gain some important insights into the deeper purpose and also philosophy of astrology. So as I said, I comprehend these traditions as quote-unquote sister sciences. And by doing this, I want to give some sense of the common philosophical and cosmological framework, the structure of reality upon which they all appear to draw. And I realize not every practitioner in this period necessarily agreed on all matters, and that imposing a monolithic framework may be premature, but at least for the purposes of general understanding, I think it gives us a useful approach to understanding the material in a new way, and also perhaps in a way that is consistent with its authentic origins. So just to state, I guess, the thesis, as it were, or the argument that I'm going to be putting forward today, it can go something like this. In the Hellenistic world, astrology, alchemy, and theurgy all refer to an explicitly Hermetic origin. They can all be understood as distinct yet overlapping sciences within the broader purview of Hermeticism. This Hermetic purview has its roots firmly in the black earth of Egyptian theological tradition. It is a cultural translation of Egyptian philosophy, science, and magic into the intellectual modalities of the Hellenistic world. In the first part of this talk, we're going to look in some detail at the major elements of the Egyptian Hermetic background, both historically and thematically. And then when we turn to into the more, I guess, the second half of this talk, when we turn to the sister sciences proper, astrology, alchemy, and magic, hopefully have a meaningful context in which to understand them and situate them. So we begin with Hermes and the Hermetica. And so who is Hermes? I mean, I hope as people interested in astrology, you all know Hermes is Mercury. But there's this great quote from Iamblichus, the Syrian theurgist from the 3rd to 4th centuries. He says, "The god Hermes, Prince of Eloquence, has from ancient times rightly been considered common to all priests. He who presides over true knowledge of the gods is one and the same throughout the world. It was him indeed that our ancestors dedicated the fruits of their wisdom, attributing all their own writings to Hermes." When we start talking about Hermes and Hermeticism, we invariably come to a body of text called the Corpus Hermeticum. And the Corpus Hermeticum is a body of writings attributed to Hermes, Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes. And this is the Greco-Egyptian Hermes. Now, at the heart of the Hermetic teachings is the realization that the individual is fundamentally identical with the primordial, ever-present divine mind, the invisible creator of the visible cosmos. Now, this realization is known as gnosis, the immediate realization, and an immediate realization of your divine origin, which is characterized as a second birth. So the Hermetic texts, in many respects, outline the path of preparation for this gnosis, or this spiritual rebirth. The Hermetic writings come down to us as a series of 17 short philosophical treatises written in Greek, along with a longer Latin text known as the Asclepius. These texts were believed in antiquity to be translations of ancient Egyptian wisdom taught by Hermes. Now, the Greeks identified Hermes with the Egyptian god Thoth, the ibis-headed divinity who also takes the form of a baboon. The baboon was revered for its intelligence, among other things. Thoth was traditionally a moon god, but is most famously known as the god of the hieroglyphs, the inventor of sacred writing. As the Amplicus suggests, he was the god who presided over all sacred or priestly arts. And it's important to realize that these priestly arts presupposed education and literacy. And so by extension, Thoth Hermes is associated deeply with everything to do with the cultivation of knowledge and ultimately divine knowledge or wisdom. So in late antiquity, the Hermetic corpus was believed to be of extremely ancient provenance. The teachings were thought to date back to at least the time of Moses, and some texts claim Hermes taught Moses or Moses taught Hermes. From late antiquity through to the 17th century, the Hermetic texts took on an important role because they were believed to be compatible with Abrahamic, Platonic, and pagan spiritual traditions. So for the Hermeticist, religion and science, philosophy and magic went hand in hand. But in the 17th century, it was recognized on linguistic grounds that the Hermetic texts were actually produced in the early centuries of the Common Era. They couldn't be of ancient Egyptian origin, and certainly not Moses. However, as with many texts, the time they were written down is not always indicative of the origins of the ideas in those texts. Okay. So up until 1945, scholars had tended to view the alleged Egyptian origins of the Hermetica and related texts as merely a Greek literary device. In other words, these texts weren't really considered to be of genuine Egyptian origin. They were simply second-rate Greek philosophical texts appealing to the exotic prestige of Egypt, or so we are told. Now what dramatically changed this view, more than anything else, was the discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices in 1945. Now the Nag Hammadi codices were a corpus of texts found in Upper Egypt, near Thebes, at the end of the Second World War. This fund of texts famously included the Gnostic Gospels. The texts frequently mentioned Christ but were considered heretical by early Christianity. So before this discovery, we really only knew about Gnosticism from its ancient opponents, the heresiologists. And so the Gnostic texts are interesting because they open rich mythology which held that the human soul was divine in origin, but was enslaved in the created world by a power-hungry divinity known as a demiurge, who was identified with the God of the Old Testament. So you can see why this became heretical. So in Gnosticism there were two divinities, a true God and a false God, one liberating and one enslaving. The Gnostic texts suggested that we could transcend the slavery of our incarnation, which was imposed by the false God, through gnosis, the liberating knowledge of our divine origin. Now what's interesting is that the Nag Hammadi codices were not only found in Egypt, they were also written in Egyptian. They were composed in Coptic. Which is a late form of the Egyptian language, written using a modified Greek script. So, I mean, the Coptic language itself is really emblematic of this period because it's got it's Egyptian origin but a Greek form, and this is a recurring theme, as we will see. What is significant for Hermeticism is that this corpus contained Coptic versions of texts that we knew from the Greek Hermetic corpus. So as a result of this, scholars were forced to reevaluate the origins of these Hermetic texts, and over the next 30 years they would eventually come to reverse their earlier opinion and recognize the Hermetic texts as genuinely Egyptian in origin. And there was a Dutch religious historian by the name of Bruno Hugo Stricker who was really the first to turn the tide of this evaluation. In 1949, just a few years after Nag Hammadi discovery, he says, "The Hermetic literature is of autochthonous Egyptian origin. The Hermetic doctrine is the esoteric doctrine of the Egyptian priesthood as it is developed in the course of the Old, the Middle, and the New Kingdom. I'm just going to wait for these crazy birds to fly over. These are cockatoos. I'm not sure if you can hear them. They fly over every morning. Let me start that again. The Hermetic literature is of autochthonous Egyptian origin. The Hermetic doctrine is thus the esoteric doctrine of the Egyptian priesthood, as it has developed in the course of the Old, the Middle, and the New Kingdom. Relationship to Orphism, Pythagorism, or any other Greek system of religion or philosophy exists only insofar as these latter are dependent on the Egyptian. On the other hand, the literary methods of Hermeticism, its terminology, composition, and argumentation by dialogue have been conscientiously copied from the Greek. And we should also add that to theology in Egypt belonged not only what we call theology proper, but also philosophy, science, and magic. So Stricker really laid it out. He really kind of hit the nail on the head in making these claims. So the next kind of phase in the I guess the reevaluation of the Egyptian origins of Hermeticism comes in 1984, when a Danish classicist and Egyptologist by the name of Erik Iversen wrote a monograph entitled Egyptian and Hermetic Doctrine. In this text, he compared the cosmology of the Egyptian Shabaka inscription, and he compared this to the Greek and Latin texts of the Hermetic corpus. What Iversen did was to show, beyond any reasonable doubt, how the core doctrines of Egyptian cosmology are recapitulated in the Corpus Hermeticum, not only in terms of broad themes, but in finite points of detail. Now the Shabaka stone, pictured here, is a small slab of green breccia of uncertain dating. It was originally installed in the temple of Ptah at Memphis, and the inscription itself tells us that it was copied from an even more ancient text, an old worm-eaten manuscript, which was thus preserved by being transferred to this stone. So despite the uncertain dating of this stone itself, the provenance of the text presents itself as very ancient. So at some point, this piece of breccia, this stone, was removed and used as a millstone or for some other secondary purpose. And you can see these big gouges, this sort of star-like shape, these gouges in this stone from the fact that it was used either as a millstone or as like a support for a column or something, some other secondary purpose. But if you look on the left and right hand sides of this image, you can see hieroglyphic inscription. You can see columns of hieroglyphic text. So what we have really is a, really like half of this text is missing due to this misuse. So despite this, it still preserves a very rich account of one of Egypt's most important cosmologies, which is today known as the Memphite cosmology, or the Memphite theology. So what's also interesting is at the beginning of the 19th century, this Shabaka stone, which is already abused by being used as a millstone, was put on a ship in Alexandria, and it came to Europe. And it wasn't transported for its own sake, but for its own Egyptological value. It was put on the ship as ballast. So this stone has a really interesting history of use and abuse after its original purpose. Okay, so what is the Memphite theology? The Memphite theology is an Egyptian vision of creation in which the divine universe is understood as a living organism, the cosmic body of the intelligible creator. The Memphite doctrine holds that all gods, and indeed all of creation, are consubstantial, that is to say, of the same nature or substance as the principal or primordial god. Now, Egyptian theologies often differ in who they regard as their principal god. It often depends on the city. But they usually have the same fundamental structure in which overarching divinity is seen as the origin and source of both the creative principle underpinning the universe and of creation proper. So one divinity underpins the creative principles of the cosmos and the cosmos itself. And in the Memphite cosmology, or the Memphite theology, this overarching divinity is Ptah. What I've written, what you can read here is really just my encapsulation of the Memphite theology, because I can't go into it in too much detail today. But it can be summarized thus. From a primordial latency in which everything is hidden in darkness, Ptah emerges as the divine mind and logos, who magically creates a second god who assists him in bringing his own body into being, and this body is the cosmos. So the second god manifests as the heart and tongue of Ptah. The heart and tongue came into existence in the form of Atum, the finisher, the all. Through the heart, which is the seat of mind, and the tongue, or the logos, Ptah conceives and commands everything that he desires. So by bringing the cosmos into being, Ptah thus brings all the gods into existence. He is said to have made their bodies in accordance with their wishes, whereupon they descended into whereupon the gods descended into inanimate nature, quote unquote, taking body in all trees, stones, clays, and all other things growing upon him. That is, growing upon Ptah. So Ptah is a craftsman god originally. We're going to come back to this point. The perceptible cosmos is really the body of the creator. So there are three main phases of Egyptian cosmology. There was pre-creation, the primordial invisible origin, from which emerge the creative principles which underpin creation, and then there is creation proper, the visible, sensible world. Now this is mirrored in three aspects of divinity. The divine mind, which in Greek was known as nous, the divine light or mind, divine speech, the logos, and the divine body, the cosmos. And in turn, these three aspects of divinity, which are in turn aspects of the phases of cosmogenesis, are kind of embodied, in a sense, in the different organs of the divine body. So there is the heart, which, as I said, the seat of the divine mind. Because the Egyptians devalued the brain, they saw the heart as the center of consciousness. So the heart is the seat of the divine mind. The tongue is the organ of speech and magical creation, which articulates the thoughts of the divine mind. And then there's the lips, the mouth, the teeth, are the organs that assist the speech or the magical articulation of creation. So with Egyptian cosmologies, you always get these overlapping trinities, these layered trinities, I suppose you might say. So overall, the coming into being of the primordial God is identical to the coming into being of the cosmos as we know it. And overall, the divine cosmos has an invisible aspect, an invisible or intelligible aspect, and a visible or sensible aspect. Between these two aspects, a third principle mediates, the creative or demiurgic principle. The craftsman who creates the visible manifestation of reality in accordance with its invisible vision. Whereas Ptah manifests as the demiurge or craftsman in order to create the manifest world proper, humankind is said to be created by the primordial God directly. He is thus of a higher order of creation than the creator gods and the gods that are manifest in creation. This idea gives rise to the Gnostic distinction that we spoke of earlier between the true God who created humankind and the demiurgic creator deity who is said to have enslaved us in flesh and matter. And the image here is, of course, the architect from The Matrix, which is a film with explicitly Gnostic themes. So this architect figure is akin to the demiurge in the sense that he enslaves us in a false reality. So as we see, there's a pessimistic or dualistic twist emerges in these texts or traditions when we get to Gnosticism, certainly, but which is not necessarily present in the Egyptian theological texts. But so for now, it's important to realize that human, who was created from earth or clay and instilled with divine spirit, is an icon of the highest divinity. It wasn't created by the demiurgic or secondary divinity. And so the human being is really an icon or divine image of the embodied divine mind. So cosmologically speaking, as we move into the Hermetic texts, cosmologically speaking, the texts of the Hermetic corpus generally follow the Egyptian paradigm. From a primordial darkness emerges light and logos, which create a demiurge or craftsman god to assist in the creation of the cosmos. So cosmos and anthropos, the universe and the human being, are said to be two forms or images of God. But one of the crucial areas where Hermetic cosmology seems to differ from its Egyptian origins is in the use of planetary cosmology, the geocentric cosmos of the Ptolemaic world. In the Hermetica, 7 planetary spheres are created by the demiurge. And we read, the god of fire and air formed 7 powers who encompass in their circles the sensory world, and the governance of these powers is called fate. So within this framework, the human being is both immortal, above fate, and mortal, subject to fate. Hermetic texts describe a descent of the immortal soul through the 7 planetary spheres into the elemental or sublunary world, the realm subject to fate, which was known in Greek as Hymarmene. More specifically, the planetary divinities instill qualities into the soul as it descends, which make the soul subject to fate. And we have a related text which tells us, when souls descend, they draw with them the sloth of Saturn, the wrath of Mars, the lust of Venus, Mercury's passion for money, and Jupiter's desire to rule. And so humankind has a double nature, both immortal and mortal. For this reason, and again we're quoting from the Hermetic texts, for this reason, of all living beings on earth, man alone is double. Mortal because of the body, immortal because of the real anthropos. For although being immortal and having an authority over all, he suffers mortal things which are subject to destiny. Then, although above the harmony of the cosmos, he has become a slave within it. So we get the sense as a Hermetic descent of the soul into the realm of fate, the sublunary world, the world under the moon, therefore under all the planetary spheres. And there's a Hermetic descent into this realm, but also they speak of a Hermetic reascent. So there's an arc which describes a fall or descent, and a counter arc which describes a reascent or liberation. When the soul reascends to its divine origin, it gives back these planetary vices to the planetary divinities which instilled them in its soul. So to the moon, it gives physical growth and decay. To Mercury, it gives malicious artifice. To Venus, lust. To the Sun, ambition to dominate. To Mars, reckless audacity. To Jupiter, greed and aggrandizement. And to Saturn, falsehood. So these are very negative or pessimistic significations but very traditional ones of the planets. So the thing with Hermeticism is that rather than waiting until death, the Hermetic way of immortality offers a means of transcending fate while embodied on Earth. That is to say, we must rise to the immortal spheres, transforming the planetary vices into virtues, before we die. This coheres with the definition of philosophy in Greek antiquity, which runs through Platonic tradition, and of course Neoplatonism, which we'll see, in which philosophy is defined as, quote unquote, learning to die before you die. So before we move on to astrology proper, the main point I want to emphasize is that the texts attributed to Hermes are invariably, quote-unquote, translations of Egyptian doctrines into a Hellenistic idiom. Rather than being direct translations, as we would expect today, when we think of a translation, today, we think of each sentence being translated line by line or word by word as faithfully as possible into another language. This process of translation from Egyptian traditions into Greek traditions was much more along the lines of a cultural translation. That is, they took the Greek intellectual and cultural world as their target language and transposed Egyptian concepts into this form. In other words, Egyptian theological concepts were cast to a Hellenistic Greek form. And so for this way we start to see how Egyptian theology and cosmology could be expressed in terms of Greek metaphysics, for instance, in this, whether Platonic cosmology or, as we've just seen, the Ptolemaic, the geocentric cosmos of the Ptolemaic world. Now, Hermes was the perfect god to preside over this process because he was the god of scribes, translators, and priests. What is more, the Greek word for translator is actually based on the name Hermes. Hermeneus in Greek is a translator or interpreter. And this meaning also extends to our modern word hermeneutics, which is a philosophical science for understanding the essence of a phenomenon, rather than merely observing or explaining the external facts. On a theological level, we can see this emerge in the Hermetic desire to know the intelligible or divine aspect of reality, rather than its sensory appearances. So on a deeper level, we can also see that the Hermetic path of immortality lies in a process of, quote-unquote, translating the planetary vices of the sublunary world into virtues. Just as in the alchemical tradition, we engage poisons in order to transform them into immortalizing medicines. And by doing this, we can actually overcome astral fatality or our embodied fate. So what's ironic here is that all of the modern scholarship that I just looked at on the Egyptian origins of the Hermetica only really affirm what was already known to the followers of Hermes in antiquity. As the 4th century Syrian theologist Iamblichus, our good friend Iamblichus, remarks, the documents that circulate under the name of Hermes contain Hermetic doctrines, even if they often employ philosophical terminology. This is because they were translated from the Egyptian tongue by men not unacquainted with Greek philosophy. So already in the 3rd to 4th century of the Common Era, Iamblichus pretty much laid it out as it is. It took scholars 1,500 years to come around. Iamblichus is good like that. So we've established this process of translation of Egyptian into Greek traditions, but what the scholarship does show us is the motivation for this translation, which is very interesting. And this motivation sheds some important light on the apparently sudden emergence of Hellenistic astrology. We must remember that in the Hellenistic period, under Greek and Roman rule, the Egyptian temples were under a slow process of decline. When they lost state support, their Egyptian state support, the priests were forced in many respects to translate their sacred sciences into a Hellenistic idiom in order for them to survive, in order for these texts or their own traditions to survive. It entailed a scaling down of the ritual apparatus, as we will see. But the socio-political background is hugely important. Social change clearly affected the Egyptian priests. It required them to adapt their mysteries to a Hellenistic audience. And Jan Assmann, the German Egyptologist, remarks that in a certain sense, the Egyptian mysteries functioned both as a successor institution to the pharaonic state and as a compensation for its loss. I think that comment is really poignant. So in this context, the temple priest frequently became a quote-unquote magician. Indeed, it is no coincidence that during this precise period, we see the emergence not only of the Hermetic corpus and the Nag Hammadi texts, as we have seen, but also the Greek magical papyri, the Greek alchemical corpus, as well as the hieratic traditions of Neoplatonic theurgy. What is more, many of these texts were either found in Egypt or explicitly originate in Egypt. But perhaps more importantly than the textual provenance, the intellectual origins of these traditions are all deeply connected to the Egyptian temples. So now I'm going to start looking at Hermes and astrology in particular. It'll be useful to explore this Hermetic genesis that I've just been speaking of at length in a little more detail with specific regard to astrology. And in this regard, I am indebted to Chris Brennan for his work on the history of Hellenistic astrology, which is actually forthcoming in his book of the same name. So what I present here thus draws on Chris Brennan's historical work on the emergence of Hellenistic astrology. However, my own research interests lie in the following question. How does this specific historical material fit within the process of Egyptian Hermetic translation that I have been articulating? In other words, what evidence do we have from the history of Hellenistic astrology proper that fits within or substantiates this Hermetic translation hypothesis? So I'm going to draw 4 points from Chris Brennan's work that I think really speak to this context that I've been describing. First, the earliest source text of the Hellenistic astrological tradition is a lost work attributed to Hermes, which would have been written sometime in the 1st century of before the Common Era or earlier. From what we know of it, from the early authors who mention it, it appears to have introduced the doctrine of the 12 places or houses and their significations. This text is important because it is a pivotal transition point between the older Mesopotamian Egyptian traditions and the emergence of Hellenistic astrology proper. What is more, Hermes is specifically regarded as the founder of Hellenistic astrology, and this lineage is preserved by Firmicus Maternus, who says, "We have written in these books all the things which Hermes and Hanubius handed down to Asclepius, which Petasiris and Kepler explained, which Abraham, Orpheus, and Critidemus wrote, and all the others knowledgeable in this art." So our own Hellenistic source texts always point back to this figure of Hermes as the source of their tradition. So secondly, we have the figures Nekepso and Petasiris, who are a king and a priest, an Egyptian king and priest. So in the Hellenistic astrology texts, 2 figures are repeatedly mentioned as sources. Although we have no complete works that survive in their name, numerous quotations from their lost texts survive. Nekepso is presented as an Egyptian king and Petasiris an Egyptian priest. Perhaps even more than the lost Hermetic text, the lost Hermes text, The works of Kepler and Petasiris are the most explicitly cited sources of Hellenistic Hellenistic astrological tradition. And needless to say, the Egyptian character of these figures is entirely consistent with the proposed origins of Hellenistic astrology in this Hermetic process. So thirdly, the following Hellenistic astrologers all cite Hermes. They all cite Petasiris and they all cite Kepler as sources. So it's Thrasyllus, Antioch of Athens, Dorotheus of Sidon, Vettius Valens, and as we've seen, Firmicus Maternus. And fourth, finally, one of the most famous and perhaps most important Hellenistic astrologers was Tiberius Claudius Balbillus, who lived in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era. And Balbillus was Thrasyllus' successor and possibly his son. Most famously, he was the court astrologer to the Roman Emperor Claudius. Well, the Roman emperors Claudius, Nero, and Vespasian. And how's that for a clientele? He was also posted in Alexandria in Egypt, where he was the high priest of the Temple of Hermes. Okay? And here too he was also the head of the museum and the library, the Alexandrian library, the famous library that was the source of most of late antique wisdom, which was, tragically burnt down. And he also possibly influenced the Mithraic astrological doctrine. So this Balbillus figure is hugely significant, but what I find striking is the fact that he was a high priest of the Temple of Hermes in Alexandria, of all places. So going beyond generalizations, what we see is some very clear and very concrete links to the influence of Hermes, and by extension, Egyptian Hermetic sources, in the genesis and development of Hellenistic astrology. And so going beyond the textual lineage, when we look at the actual practice of astrology in the Hellenistic period, we encounter some even more startling evidence. A handful of not only textual but also material sources provide evidence for the use of astrological boards as part of the actual consultation process of astrology. These boards featured a zodiac, or sometimes two, decans with Egyptian names and features, markers for the terms or bounds, and in the center, the divinities Helios and Selene, or the sun and moon. And the picture on the right here is an example, probably the best preserved example, which comes to us from Grand or Granus, a Gallo-Roman city, which is now in Lorraine in France. We've also had glass examples found in Egypt, in the oasis of the Dakhla oasis in Egypt. And there's at least three examples of these boards that we actually have. Most of them are broken. Now the use of these astrological boards seems to explain why we don't really have many hand-drawn horoscopes in this period. We mainly have lists of planetary data. What is interesting, however, beyond the beauty of the boards themselves, is that special stones were used on these boards to mark the planets. A fragment from the Greek magical papyri gives us some very important clues, and it is no coincidence that it comes from the Greek magical papyri, of all places. A voice comes to you speaking. Now that is significant. A voice comes to you speaking. Let the stars be set upon the board in accordance with their nature, except for the sun and the moon. And let the sun be golden, the moon silver, Cronus of obsidian, Aries of reddish onyx, Aphrodite lapis lazuli, veined with gold, Hermes turquoise. Let Zeus be of whitish stone or crystalline, and the horoscope or the ascendant, in accordance with nature, let it lie. And the text breaks up. So this is literally a papyrus fragment that we don't really have the beginning or the end of. But what we do have is incredibly revealing. So we will deal with the stones in just a moment, but the first thing I want to highlight is the reference to the the voice that comes to you speaking. This remark, especially in the context of the magical papyri, which is filled with spells for supernatural communication, is a clear indicator that the astrologer communed with the gods during the consultation. Evans, who did an important study of these boards, also tells us that Pedicyrus was instructed by a voice which came to him in the darkness of night. So there seems to be this indication of a mystical communion involved with astrological practice. This is a crucial clue. It takes us right to the heart of the theurgical, magical, and alchemical practices, solidifying the Hermetic background to these traditions that we have been describing. Now, two details need to be explored here. Firstly, the use of specific material substances in relation to a process of communing with the divine. This is no coincidence. The substances are clearly sympathetic extensions of the planetary divinities, exactly in the way that the stones, clays, and plants which grow in the body of Ptah are extensions of divinity in the Hermetic and Egyptian cosmology. More specifically, they suggest practices closely associated with theurgy, which used special substances to not only commune with the gods, but also to unite with them and ultimately to become vehicles for them. So, what is theurgy? And again, here's our good friend Iamblichus, the 4th century Syrian theurgist, known as the divine Iamblichus to his followers. Theurgy literally means divine work, or the work of the gods, in the same way that metallurgy means metalwork, or the working of metals. It was a hieratic art, that is to say, a sacred science, which famously used material symbols and compositions in unspeakable rites to invoke and unite with the divine. And as I said, ultimately to become vehicles for the divine, or vehicles for the gods. In the same way that the cosmos was, in a sense, the organs of the god Ptah. The theurgist sought to become an organ or extension of the divine body. The second detail that I want to explore is the magical stones and the gems. The magical stones themselves, which are clearly associated with the planetary divinities, as we have seen. They also link specifically with the phenomenon of magical and Gnostic gems. And this list of correspondences here comes from the source I read out before, and also another written source which describes the use of stones on magical boards. We have two sources which describe this process, and these are the specific correspondences that these sources give. So what we need to realize here is that the correspondences between the stones and the gods is derived directly from the Hermetic cosmology that we detailed earlier. The idea that the cosmos is the body of the primordial being, that the substances of the material, the clays, the stones, the plants, the animals, which grow on his body, and into which different divinities descend in order to animate them. This basic framework provides the background to the Hermetic and Neoplatonic theories of signatures, or cosmic sympathies and antipathies, that come down to us through Islamic, medieval, and Renaissance esotericism. But of course, their roots are deeply grounded in this Hermetic cosmology, where gods animate the natural world. So to understand how these gems were made and why they were magically significant, we must turn once again to the Greek magical papyri. And here we find a revealing rite for making and consecrating a gemstone for use as a ring, a talismanic ring. So many of the gemstones pictured here were actually made to be set in rings, and there's often grooves and beveling for that purpose. We have this fascinating rite from the magical papyri which describes the creation of one of these astrological gemstones. It says, and this is a solar gemstone, Helios is to be engraved on a heliotrope stone as follows. A thick-bodied snake in the shape of a wreath should be shown having its tail in its mouth, and this is the Ouroboros, the tail-eating serpent. Inside the circle, formed by a snake, let there be a sacred scarab surrounded by rays. On the reverse side of the stone, you are to inscribe the name and hieroglyphics as the prophets pronounce it. Then, when you have consecrated the ring, wear it when you are pure. The consecration begins at dawn facing the sun. And as you can see, we have examples of gemstones which very closely match this exact description. When you perform this rite, say the spell 3 times each day. This is interesting because we start to get very specific astrological timings connected with the creation of the gem in this rite. When you perform this rite, say the spell 3 times each day in the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hour. And this for 14 days, beginning when the moon begins in the 3rd quarter. And try to have the goddess, that is the moon, either rising in the zodiacal sign of the bull, or the virgin, or the scorpion, or the water carrier, or the fishes. And the text goes on to say, whenever you wish to command the god, give your command saying the greatest name, U4, and he will perform. Here it is truly written out, with all brevity, the rite by which all modeled images and engravings and carved stones are made alive. Okay, so this is a rite for animating the stone with the presence of the god. And this is done with specific astrological timings and associations and sympathies and signatures. I'm just going to depart from my notes here because, well, not so much depart. I printed my notes out and the last few pages disappeared, so I'm just going to have to deliver the rest off the cuff. But we're near the end, so I just want to wrap up by drawing out a few more details about statue animation. This idea of animating this stone from this ring really evokes the Egyptian traditions of statue animation. And the scholars Moyer and Dieleman made the point that this specific ring consecration rite that I've just read to you is a scaled-down mouth-opening ritual. And we'll get to that in just a tick. A mouth-opening ritual was this, the Egyptian rite for animating statues, animating divine images, and revivifying the dead. The religious historian Jonathan Z. Smith had the theory that the magical practices of antiquity were often miniaturizations of temple rites, originally by priests, but adapted for private or portable practice by magicians. So you get this when you get the transition from the temple culture into I guess when that temple culture spills out into the Hellenistic world, which is a very syncretistic world, the priest becomes a magician, and they have to scale down or miniaturize the elements of their practice because they don't have a whole temple to work with anymore. So they have to improvise to some degree. So their portable ritual apparatus, like as we've seen, the astrological boards and the magical gemstones and the sympathetic substances are all to some degree part of this portable ritual apparatus. But the ring in particular is a stand-in for a statue. And what Moyer and Dieleman point out is that this magical name that the text emphasizes, U4, seems to be a Greek rendering of the Egyptian expression Opet Ra, which is the Egyptian name for the ceremony of the opening of the mouth, as I said, the statue animating ritual. So, this is interesting because just for this detail about the astrological boards and the fact that they use stones connected with the gods opens up a very rich world where it takes us right back to, it takes us back to, immediately back to magical practices from the Hellenistic period. But that itself, opens up our, even further into the core rites of Egyptian consecration and the divine vivification of matter. And what's interesting there is that the creation of a magical gemstone is equivalent to the creation of a divine icon, the creation and animation of a statue, for instance. But this itself is a recapitulation of the process of cosmogenesis and this whole idea that we began with, that the Creator creates a body in which His mind, the divine mind, can literally embody. So the material body, whether it's a cosmos, a statue, or a stone, is vivified with divine presence, and it thus becomes a vehicle for divinity. And this is a motif that emerges in the Corpus Hermeticum. We have an explicit passage in the Asclepius, which discusses the ability, the power of making statues which can heal and harm and have all these magical abilities to have divinatory abilities. They have the power of prophecy, among other things. This comes up in the Corpus Hermeticum. It comes up in, it's intrinsic to theurgy, and when we've just seen that it's expressed explicitly in the magical papyri and the ring consecration rite. And it also comes up in the origins of alchemy. And I want to look briefly at the figure of Zosimos of Panopolis, who was a figure roughly contemporary with Iamblichus, actually. Zosimos of Panopolis was an Egyptian alchemist in the Hellenistic world, who was closely connected with the Temple of Ptah at Memphis. So this is interesting because it brings us back again to this point we began with, the Temple of Ptah, which was the location of the Shabaka stone, which gave us the Memphite theology, and from which emerges the Hermetic cosmology, and so on. But the god Ptah is really an alchemical god in his wider associations, because he is identical with Hephaestus or Vulcan in the Greco-Roman world. In a broader sense, I mean, in the Memphite cosmology, Ptah is really the ultimate god, because Memphis was the seat of Ptah. They made him the supreme god, but generally speaking, he was more identified with the demiurgic figure, the craftsman god, the creator god, who shapes matter on behalf of the primordial divine mind. So there's some slight shifts in how traditions express these realities in terms of different gods, but that's standard. But what's interesting with alchemy is always involved with substance, and again we've got this theme that stones, metals, minerals, gems are kind of the bread and butter of the alchemical work. These are, the alchemists sought to reveal the divine nature or properties through these substances. But when you look at the temple culture of Zosimos at the Temple of Ptah at Memphis, it is very closely connected with the rites of statue animation, because a lot of the alchemical work that the Hellenistic alchemists were working on involved gilding techniques for creating a gild or a stain that would permanently penetrate and cover a metal or other object, and effectively turn it into gold or silver or another kind of metal, a precious metal. So what you tend to find in the alchemical context of these Egyptian temples was that the craftsman, the alchemist, and the priest worked hand in hand, and they were often overlapping functions. So, and we have to remember the priest was also the magician, the one who consecrated and animated the statue. So again, we get we start to see how these traditions not only broaden and encompass a wider purview of sciences and arts than we're usually led to believe. It's a much more holistic context. But another motif that comes out was Zosimos, which is, I think, extremely fascinating, is that idea of the Chrysanthropos, which means the man of gold. And Zosimos spoke of a man of light. Okay, he used the Greek term phos, or light. Anthropos phos, I think, is the Greek expression. He talked about a man of light hidden in a body of clay, and he compared, and he drew on Judaic tradition and compared this body of clay with Adam, which Hebrew I understand is the word for clay. This, and again, it starts referring to Judaic themes of anthropogeny, where the primordial being, Adam, is fashioned from clay and infused with divine spirit by God. So again, we get this theme of divine animation of matter at the heart of alchemy. And Zosimos was Egyptian, and he wrote in Greek, but he also drew on Judaic and Gnostic motifs. So he certainly spoke of, he makes a really sharp distinction between the body of clay, which is essentially the body of the sublunary world. It's formed of the elemental world. Okay, so it's formed from the world under the moon, under all the planetary forces, under the sway of fate. But he says within that body of clay is a body of light, or a man of light, or being of golden, an immortal being of luminosity. And again, this resonates or evokes this Gnostic motif that we mentioned at the beginning, where there's a true anthropos that is higher than the created or mortal level of being. Again, this double nature of man. There's a tendency in alchemy and Hermeticism and also Gnosticism to have a very dualistic approach to this double nature, to see one as something to be escaped from and avoided through transcendence towards the other. But in theurgy is interesting, and you do get it you get a sense of this in Zosimos as well, that as in metals, matter can become a vehicle for the divine element rather than an impediment for the divine element. And I would say the same is true of fate itself. And I think by way of starting to wrap up this talk today, I just want to touch on some of the philosophical implications of these traditions. We've got this idea of a need for liberation from astral fatality, or hymarmene, our entrapment in the world of fate and destiny. And in the Hellenistic world, we had, and certainly among the people who dealt with astrology, we have a few different kind of philosophical approaches. And we have a Stoic approach, which is represented in particular by Vettius Valens, who is probably the most brilliant technical astrologer. But his philosophy was more Stoic in the sense that he said we can't really escape from fate. But we can adapt ourselves to it and in a sense harmonize with it. we have in a figure like Ptolemy, who wrote the Tetrabiblos, we have a more Aristotelian approach. He doesn't really deal with, well, not to my knowledge anyway, this issue, but his philosophical premise really is just to provide a scientific justification of planetary influences through rays and so forth. And I think Chris Brennan pointed out that this is one of the reasons why this text has survived and been so influential for so long, because it had a philosophical justification that made it, that kind of held water, at least in terms of how the ancient world thought about things. But the approach I've been looking at today is different from either of these. We have this more Hermetic or Neoplatonic approach represented by Iamblichus and Zosimos, and in particular. And it's the idea that fate can be transcended by assent to an embodiment of the divine mind. And this entailed not only a process of apotheosis or deification, of ascending to the immortal nature above fate, and so this is where it seems dualistic, where you're escaping from the world. But also the other side of this process, I mean, if one arc is an ascent, the other arc is always a descent, creating this kind of grand Ouroboros cycle. But when you descend in a way without being entrapped by the planetary divinities, you can do it in a way in which you participate in cosmogenesis. So you act in the capacity of the gods, and just as the gods in the Memphite theology descended into and animated all the different parts of the cosmos, all the clays and the stones and the animals and the plants, so too when you ascend to the divine mind, can you in a sense descend again into the world of fate without being caught up or negatively enslaved in it. There's this quote by Iamblichus that I just want to mention, which speaks to this, the astrological component to this. He does speak of astrological timing, or katarchic, or electional astrology. And he's talking about the Hermeticists, or the Theurgists, who rise up through hieratic theurgy toward the higher and more universal levels above fate, to God and the demiurge, and without material attachment or any other help at all, except for observing the proper time, the kairos, the opportune moment. Hermes also gave instruction in this way, which Bittis, the prophet, translated for King Amun after finding it carved in hieroglyphic letters in the shrines of Sais in Egypt. So what's interesting there is that we know Iamblichus doesn't really, he considers astrology a genuine divine science, a genuine hieratic art, but he doesn't really he's not really interested in the dynamics of fate in the same way that a figure like Vettius Valens would be interested in. But he is interested in the astrological timing, or the katarchic electional astrology, which can choose the opportune moment, the kairos, for undertaking this theurgic rite of ascent to divine origin and rising above the world of fate. So that brings me to the conclusion of my talk. I just want to sum up the major things I've touched on today. So we've seen that Hellenistic astrology has distinct Hermetic origins, and I would argue that because of this, it really does benefit from being situated within an Egyptian Hermetic cosmological framework. Now, I'm not arguing that that is the only framework that you should look at Hellenistic astrology in, or the only framework that benefits it, but I think it is certainly a major one. Certainly because the texts themselves all point to Hermes and Egyptian traditions as their origin. Now this framework encompasses not only astrology but theurgy, alchemy, the magical papyri, and also certain Gnostic motifs. And within this broader purview of hieratic sciences, sacred arts, the magician, the astrologer, the alchemist, the theurgist are all overlapping functions. So each, in a sense, can be conceived as specialized vocations of the temple priest. So ultimately, Hermeticism has a soteriological function, that is concerned with liberation from fate. But this idea of liberation from the sublunary world need not take a dualistic, antagonistic form. So just as gems, the stones, the clays, the plants, the animals, and indeed the very planets themselves are vehicles for divinity, so too can we ourselves become vehicles, extensions of the divine in the realm of embodiment. So thank you for listening to me today. I believe we're going to take some questions in just a tick. Before I take questions, I just want to, if you're interested in my work and you want to stay in touch or keep abreast of future projects, I've got a few places you can do so. The first, my own website, aaroncheak.com, which I've got a bunch of articles and so forth. I've got hieratica.org, which is my project Ars Hieratica, which is devoted to the sacred arts and sciences. And I have webinars. I have a few webinars up there, and I'm developing more. So that's something to keep checking back on for more webinars along the lines of what I've done today. I work with Rabido Press, my colleague Jen's Art, who some of you may know through Kepler College here, and I run Rabido Press, and we publish interesting books. So that's another avenue to check out. If you want to email me about anything, my address is theperfectblack@gmail.com. And again, thanks for listening, and I hope you found today's talk edifying.
Well, thank you, Aaron. We do have a couple of questions. The first one, commentary. With the Christian Gnostic trajectories, what comes to mind is the 7 devils cast from Magdalene in the Book of Luke only. And they never really sort of made the connection so concretely between that, and even though in the Gospel, the passage, there's a piece of the acrons put into the mouth of the risen Jesus as received via Gnosis by Mary Magdalene. And just wondering if you see if you see thoughts on that or any other correlations?
Yeah, well, the archons are essentially the planetary divinities in the Gnostic cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
And they were seen in a negative sense. It's a very dualistic and pessimistic worldview in which we're seen as enslaved by these planetary divinities, which were called archons. Archons means like rulers, basically. And so there was a 7-fold system of enslavement. So the astrological associations I showed with those before, the significations were all pessimistic, like Mars is, audacity and so forth, and Saturn was falsehood and stuff. But what's interesting, in a sense, these are the 7 planetary, the 7 sins, but the positive aspects are in a sense the 7 virtues.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to put it in a Christian context, it's I'm sure theologians would disagree, but I think I make a case for understanding these as 7 vices and 7 virtues. It's kind of a ladder. The 7 vices, which are how we come down into this world of suffering, but the vices are how we climb back up again. So that this 7-fold scale is something that we can descend and also reascend.
Well, you certainly see that even through in the Middle Ages with Dante's poem.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
There's another commentary here. It seems that both the descent and ascent represent philosophical initiation, and in that case, fate seems like it would be its own god or power in the system. Is Saturn the god of fate, representing both the beginning of the descent into matter and the release therefrom?
Mm. Well, certainly in that system, Saturn is the outermost planet, so it's the last one you would overcome if you were reascending to your divine origin through that sort of scale. And if you're coming down again, it's certainly the first. So in a sense, it is the first and the last, depending on which angle you're coming from. In the other sense, the Earth or the Moon is the first and the last. But we do get traditions of the whole idea of descent and ascent is very initiatory, yes. And the magical papyri in particular, and also the Orphic texts, very often involve a descent into the underworld. So rather than climbing back up to our divine origin, they go through a descent into the realm of the dead, into Hades. And this is related to the idea of dying before you die, learning to overcome death in the midst of life in order to find the divine element. And I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Dante, because that's exactly what they do. They descend into the inferno, and it's only when you reach the bottom, the nadir of hell, that you can ascend to heaven. I mean, in Dante's Inferno, it's exactly the uttermost nadir of hell, and I think the ninth realm, where he encounters Lucifer, that he literally turns around, he inverts, turns upside down, and makes the ascent to heaven. So these traditions are very much initiatory journeys.
It isn't interesting in Dante too. He has Virgil as a guide until he's going through into heading for the celestial realms when he trades off to Beatrice. It sounds like was there a similar echo in the Hellenistic period did they have the tradition of like having a guide and both male and female?
Yeah, well, often, I mean, definitely Hermes is always a guide in the underworld. Hermes Cathonios was literally the underworldly Hermes who guided the dead guided the soul through the realm of the dead. But in the Gnostic texts, it's interesting because I didn't even mention it today. I mean, going into the full realm of Gnosticism is just kind of a little bit out of the scope, but there's a figure of Sophia who is, and Sophia in Greek means wisdom, so it was this divine wisdom goddess who emanated from the primordial god, and who was related to the whole process of descent and ascent. So we have to sense that a feminine figure is related to our fall. This is a very kind of Christian understanding, but in Gnosticism, she's also kind of related to our salvation and our ascent again. She helps us navigate through those archons and give back the negative vices and reascend to our divine origin. And what's interesting in that sense, the role of the feminine in this process, I showed an image from The Matrix, and there's a bunch of films that you can consider Gnostic films because they really replicate a Gnostic mythology in which we're entrapped in a false or deceptive world which we try to break out of. And another film that does that very well is called The Truman Show, a Jim Carrey film, and it's really worth watching with Gnosticism in mind because the premise is that he's in this reality show where the world around him is totally fake, but everyone knows, everyone's watching it, but he's the only person that does. He's born and bred in this world. He doesn't even know it's fake. But there's a female figure, is a love interest comes along, and she starts to take sympathy for him and starts sort of giving him some clues. I forget the details, but she's kind of instrumental to helping him escape this false world that he's entrapped in, and also helping him cultivate his gnosis and his desire for liberation. So, but definitely, I think that theme there's definitely guides. We can't do it alone.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, any recommended texts on Hermes' teachings?
Well, I would always say go to the sources. The Corpus Hermeticum is available in pretty good translations these days.
Do you have a favorite translation for that, or would you recommend taking a couple of translations just to get the difference?
I would. There's the two of the more recent ones are quite good. There's a book called The Way of Hermes, which is quite good, and there's another one called I think it's just called Hermetica, by I think it's Copenhagen's translation. Both of those are good. There's a Walter Scott edition, which is quite old. The translation is not so reliable, but it has the Greek text and the Latin text, so it's kind of nice for that. If you want to look at the original language, get the Scott edition, but get one of the other editions for his, if you want more reliable translations. But certainly the book The Way of Hermes is a really nice little edition, though. So The Way of Hermes or the Copenhagen's Hermetica I would recommend as starting points at least.
Okay. And what about some accessible readings on early alchemy?
Oh God. Accessible. I'd recommend my own book, but I'm not sure I'd call it accessible. It's kind of dense and academic, but it's kind of rich and for that. Early alchemy is. There still needs to be a lot of work done on early alchemy, and I'm one of the people trying to do that work. I'm not saying I'm the only one, but most of the people doing that work are very specialized scholars. So I'm kind of struggling to think of a book that really looks at the early alchemical world, because the problem is that the Greek alchemical texts haven't really been translated into English. I mean, we have a few translations, but the corpus as a whole is largely untranslated, unless you read French. There's been a French translation for the last 100 years or more. I do have an article on, one of the major articles in my book is on Egypt and alchemy. I look at the Egyptian background, but also the kind of all the rich Hermetic and Gnostic materials that I've looked at today. Not all of it, but like that kind of material and the magical papyri, all that kind of stuff. I try to show how it's really comes out of the Egyptian background in the same way that I did with astrology today. And so definitely I recommend, and actually my book has 3 major chapters on Egyptian and Greek alchemy. One by the Lithuanian philosopher Algirdas Divinus, who died a few years ago, which is an amazing piece looking at the continuities between Egyptian ritual tradition and Neoplatonism and alchemy. So he looks at the theurgic and the alchemical context more explicitly, and really shows, like, really strongly how they're rooted in Egyptian practices. And he looks more at the Egyptian material distinctly. And there's a piece on Hephaestus, the god Vulcan Hephaestus, as a demiurge in Greek alchemy. There's at least 3 solid chapters on that material in that book. I'm not sure I can think of another book that's accessible that has that kind of concrete engagement.
Okay, well the last one for wondering about resources, if there's any good edition on the pyramid texts that illustrate the process of statue animation.
Pyramid text. I mean, there's probably references to statue animation in the pyramid text and a bunch of, standard Egyptian liturgy. I'm not sure if there is an edition. It's been a while since I've dealt with the pyramid texts. I know that I remember the Faulkner translation, and at the time, to me, it seemed good. I've heard about a couple people who have done recent translations or reworkings of this material, and then with more esoteric sensitivities, but I haven't actually explored this material myself. So, I mean, I would start with the Faulkner translation, but I'm not sure offhand. I mean, feel free to email me and I can rectify this, whoever asks the question. But if there is a more recent translation or more reliable translation, But the mouth opening texts in particular were translated into German. There was a complete edition of the Tomb of Rekhmira, which has the most complete edition of the mouth opening scenes. Yeah, and that was published and translated by Eberhard Otto, a German Egyptologist in I think the mid to late 20th century. So that's kind of inaccessible unless you read German. And I used to have a copy of this text, but I lost it, unfortunately. So I'd like to get back to that material and see, and also see if there's any more recent and ideally English translations.
In astrology, we've been going through quite a revolution in the past few years of getting text translated to English, good text that we haven't had. Is the same thing happening with the Hermetic traditions? Are there more people interested in actually getting good translations these days?
Well, the Hermetic tradition is not so much of a problem because the Corpus Hermeticum has been floating around in translated form for certainly since Marsilio Ficino in the Florentine Renaissance translated it into Latin. Since then we've had various versions. It hasn't been the same situation with Hellenistic astrology where a lot of the major source texts have only come to light in more recent years. But there is a similar situation in the alchemical world, as I said, and with the alchemical texts, there's a wealth of material that is just untranslated unless you read French, and even then the French translations are over 100 years old. And there's a few texts, the 4 books of Pseudo-Democritus, some of Zosimos's material that have come to light in good English editions. I've just done a translation myself of a Greek alchemical lexicon, which appears at the beginning of most of these manuscripts. It's a short-ish lexicon which kind of defines terms in a way, but not in a, when alchemy is never very helpful. It doesn't, if it defines its terms, it kind of just gives you new terms to be confused about. So, but it's this kind of enigmatic lexicon, which after I finish this webinar and have some time to get back to research and writing, that's one of the main things I'm going to go back to, is because I can't really put that text out. Even though I've done the translation, I can't really put that out without commentary because it is very enigmatic. So I've just got to go back and do that. So there's that. But yeah, the Hermetic texts are pretty well covered. There are some, there's the Corpus Hermeticum. What's interesting with that is that because it was regarded as an ancient text by the Greeks, it was translated, it came in as I said, Marsilio Ficino in Renaissance Italy, translated into Latin because he thought Hermes was this ancient sage, as old as Moses, and so he was commissioned to translate Plato's texts as well as the Hermetic texts, and he translated the Hermetic texts before Plato because at the time they regarded Hermes as more ancient and more important, which I think says a lot about, how they were valued. And because Hermeticism and also the Gnostic texts have been very closely bound up with understanding Christian theology, or at least having connections or shedding light on Christian theologies in the early centuries of the Common Era, these texts have been very much deeply studied by philologists, by classical philologists and biblical scholars for like hundreds of years. And most of the major studies of the Hermetic texts, go back at least 100 years. You want to read Reitzenstein in German from he was interesting because he actually said like just as Iamblichus said, these texts were actually Egyptian in origin, just cast in the Greek form. Reichenstein was really the first modern scholar to say the same thing in 1901 or so, and then it took 50 years for the scholarly world to turn around. It took the Nag Hammadi corpus, for them to turn around and to really wake up to the fact that, hey, Iamblichus was right. Reichenstein was, in his broadest thrusts, correct. So yeah, there's a richer scholarly history there than there is, say, with alchemy, because for a long time alchemy has just been dismissed as pseudoscience since the 17th century. So there hasn't been as much scholarly interest except for the last, say, 30 years or so.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm really glad that you were able to do this for us. I hope we have you back again.
Yeah, it'd be great to come back. All right, thanks, Enid.